John Grant here in Los Angeles. It's the 405 Live on Saturday morning. And joining us is Lee Stranahan. If you are one of his 20-some thousand followers on Twitter, you know exactly who he is. If not, I'm going to tell you. Lee was 5 years staff artist animator at NBC Burbank for Access Hollywood. He's produced YouTube videos with millions of views and featured on CNN, LA Times. He's a featured writer on a wide variety of topics at some of the world's most viewed websites, including the Huffington Post. And then along came BigGovernment.com. How did you meet Andrew Breitbart, and how did that whole thing sort of shift gears when you were an innocent animator, staff artist at NBC Burbank? How did that whole thing roll over?
Well, yeah, thanks a lot for having me, John. So I did the political videos back in 2006, 2007, back when I was working at Access. And that led to the Huffington Post writing gig where I blogged for, many years. And I was a liberal at that time. I actually voted for Barack Obama in 2008. And, did what I could to help him get elected in 2008 as well. And then pretty much as soon as he got elected, almost immediately, I started to see some problems. In particular, that things he had run on, such as, take healthcare, for instance. Back in the primaries, he was against the individual mandate, which is the whole point, the whole Supreme Court decision, that's coming down, is about the mandate. And he was opposed to the individual mandate, and so was I. I thought the individual mandate was horrible and probably unconstitutional and everything else. And you got to remember, back in the primary, Obama was the guy who was against that. Hillary was pro-individual mandate, and Obama made statement after statement that he was against the mandate. So, for instance, very quickly after he got elected, it became obvious to me that he had just completely switched positions on that, 180-degree shift, with no explanation whatsoever. He didn't come out and say, I rethought this individual mandate thing. I know I said it was wrong, but here's my new thinking on it. He just switched without saying anything. And so I was very quickly an extremely dissatisfied Obama voter. And for reasons that, like I said, weren't, that I think are, valid. He did stuff that was the opposite of what he said he would do. And so along the way, I was writing about that stuff in the Huffington Post. And then I was in a period where I was doing a lot of interviews with people. I like interviewing people. So I sort of decided to reach out to Andrew Breitbart because I noticed that everybody on the left, he was like Satan. Everyone hated. He was the most hated person on the left. You mentioned his name, and they said he was crazy.
I actually I pulled a video from Mediaite from 2-3 weeks ago, which actually was done in May in 2011.
Yeah.
And you were in the video, and Andrew was in the video, and they identified you as a then liberal blogger. So. And anyway, as this thing was rolling, I kept hearing, F-bombs being hurled at him from every direction when he was attempting to talk to, whoever was interviewing him. So I know exactly what you mean.
No, he really was. So I was like, I realized that we had a mutual acquaintance, which means I had a way to get to Breitbart. So I reached out to that mutual acquaintance and I said, hey, I'd like to interview him. This is the mutual acquaintance of Patarico, a blogger named Patarico, who I knew a tiny little bit from my work on the Edwards story, where he'd been very nice about some stuff I'd said about that. Even though we were on different sides of the aisle at the time, he was a good guy about that. And so he gave Andrew my number, and Andrew called, and we ended up talking about, Breitbart and I ended up talking for about 2 hours in our very first conversation. We just immediately hit it off. He was about the same age as me. He was a few years younger. He was like 4 years younger. Same age as my wife, same age as my brother. And we had similar, and he lived in L.A. and I'd lived in L.A. So he's
both in the entertainment business.
And both had a background in the entertainment business. We both delivered pizza Um, and we both had a bunch of kids, and two of his kids are the exact same age as two of my kids. He had an 11 and a 13-year-old, so do I. And he had younger kids, and we have younger kids. And so we just personally hit it off. And Andrew was a very funny, jocular person. I mean, if you weren't attacking him, he was a nice guy. If you came up and you just started yelling at him, he'd yell back. But if you just talked to the guy, he was charming, actually. And so we ended up talking quite a bit that first night, and just about everything from music to politics. And in the course of that, he said, well, look, he was going through some of the stuff with Shirley Sherrod. He had not been sued yet. That came a few months later, but he was talking about that. And he said, well, I think I know, what happened there. And he said, it's this thing called the Pigford settlement. Have you heard of it? And I said, no, I've never heard of it. He said, well, look into it. He said, I'm not going to say much more. He said, look into it yourself, see if you think there's something there. And this is, again, also typical Breitbart. He didn't he didn't come out and say, well, look, this is my position and you need to take it. He literally was like, look, I want your opinion. Take a look at it, see if you think there's something there. So I looked into the Pigford settlement, and I did a few hours of research because it was interesting. And sure enough, I thought that there was something there. I thought there was a story there about this massive settlement that was supposed to help these black farmers who had been the subject of discrimination by the U.S. government. And instead, it had turned into a big fraud scheme that seems tightly connected to Obama and election issues. And it really didn't take too much research to figure out that there was a story there, and furthermore, that nobody in the mainstream media was covering the story. So Andrew and I kept talking about that story, and I said, yeah, there is something there. And I'm a filmmaker, and I said, I think the right way to do this is I can go out on the road and start interviewing people, and let's get a film out of this. And so what I thought was going to be about a week or two's trip turned into a 3-month journey, there's no other way to put it, on Pigford. And the interview that you're talking about there, where you saw with Andrew and I, that was at the very tail end of 3 months of being on the road. And over the course of that time, because I was, and I was still a liberal at that time, but the first thing that happened was, because I was working with Breitbart, I lost all my liberal friends. Like everybody who I was friendly with on the left, which was everybody. That was where people I worked with, and everybody. They didn't even want to hear what I was working on. It was very, very interesting. They didn't care. The fact that I was working with Breitbart and I was off the reservation, nothing else needed to be said. And that really told me a lot about them. I don't know how else to put it. I'd seen that a little bit. I'd already been kicked off the Daily Kos site a year or two earlier for having said that it seemed to me that John Edwards might be having an affair.
Would you call that your political epiphany? I mean, when I see his videos, I didn't know him personally. He doesn't look like the kind of guy that is out to win you over, at least not for public consumption, for the rest of us to see. But, when he worked with you professionally or others, was he looking to kind of bring you across and sort of, talk you into looking at things a different way?
No, what was interesting is Andrew and I never, like I said, we never argued about politics. In the 18 months that I knew him right up till when he passed, we never really argued about politics. He would, even on the first night, we would get into a topic, and like abortion came up, and I'm like, well, how do you feel, feel about that? And he said he didn't jump into baby killers or that sort of thing. He said, look, I'm adopted. He said I was born in 1969 and I'm adopted. He said I'm a pre-Roe kid. He said, I've always had the feeling that if it was post-Roe, I might not be here. He said, wow. So that sort of forms my opinion on things. No, right, exactly. Now, you can't argue with that in a sense. It's because it's his personal experience. So you can't really, he wasn't being argumentative, he was just being honest. That's the way he felt about it. Well, that never occurred to me, right? I was like, yeah, that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? Like it didn't change my opinion on abortion at that point. Other stuff has subsequently, I would say, changed it somewhat. But that's the way Andrew would be. He didn't feel a need to pull out a bunch of intellectual arguments. He wasn't insulting. He was just like, this is where I come down on the issue. And then he was interested in where I came down, so.
Yeah. Since Andrew passed, you and Brandon Darby seem to be the ones catching all the javelins for the Breitbart organization. Why do you think that is?
Well, I would throw Dana Lash and Liberty Chick in there as well. I think part of it is that Brandon and I had and Liberty Chick and Dana as well, and a few other people. But Brandon and I were friends with Andrew. Like we worked with him, but primarily we were friends with him, who would talk to him at 2 a.m. or whatever. And we knew, because he told us, he was really clear what he wanted. Now, and that meant something to us. And Andrew's. And he had this conversation with us 3-4 days before he passed. And again, it's always interesting, people, whatever your spiritual beliefs are. People say sometimes, they have conversations with people right before they leave in a situation like that. And there's some sort of weird stuff. Andrew had conversations with us literally 3-4 days before he passed about what his editorial vision was. And it's actually similar to what he said the first conversation I had. He felt like he was always interested. He didn't care about the election. He didn't, he barely, he would talk about it because it was important, but that's not where he was interested, because his thing was everybody's talking about the election. His passion was stories that nobody else was talking about that he could get in and own completely. The Pigford story, the Occupy story when we covered it. Nobody else was talking about the Occupy Wall Street thing the way we were when we started covering it. Some people suddenly started to pick it up, but the mainstream media was all very positive, and no one was talking about the deep left influences on Occupy that happened. And that's just another, couple of examples. Or this Brett Kimberlin thing that's come up subsequently. No,
yeah, I did want to shift gears a little bit, talk about swatting. I'm looking, and it seems like you guys have got a pretty big reward that keeps piling up, with information leading to the arrest and conviction of the swatter. Who's the law enforcement body that owns this right now? Are these local efforts in Eric Erickson's town, or is this FBI, or God forbid the Holder Justice Department? But who's at the helm of this investigation, as far as you know?
Well, I got to say, Brandon and I probably would have different takes on this since he's worked with the FBI. I am personally very unhappy with the way law enforcement has handled it. Now, I think what Brandon would say is that just because we don't know publicly what's going on with law enforcement doesn't mean that there's not other stuff going on behind the scenes. And of course, that's true, right? And I don't, they don't, in an investigation, they don't talk about things. However, that being said, from what I've seen, I just don't think law enforcement has taken this seriously. And the fact that, and look, we know there's a guy, Ron Briner. He should absolutely be interviewed. And the reason he should be is not because he's a suspect, although some people think he is, but because he was actually on the phone when one of these swattings occurred. He was a witness, in other words, to one of the swattings. For that reason alone, I think that they should have interviewed him. I mean, he's the only person who was actually on the phone with someone who was swatted. Now, again, Patrick Fry, who was swatted, also thinks that Ron's voice sounds like the swatters. And I understand why Pat thinks that. But at bare minimum, because he's a witness, law enforcement should have talked to this guy. And they haven't. And Ron has also made bizarre accusations against other people that Pat was he's accused me and Patarico and everybody else. He's included half a dozen people of being the swatter, which I find interesting too. So, like I say, I think that there's more that law enforcement could have done. It's got to be the FBI because these things have happened in different states, right? So,
right.
But on the other hand, the thing that just happened to Eric. Boy, I wish somebody would, I don't really care who does it, but somebody from law enforcement needs to start at least interviewing people and talking to them. And even that basic level of investigation does not appear to have been done.
See, you've got a lot of personal stuff out there. You've got your email address, you've got your telephone, text message number, your Skype address. Are you, looking over your shoulder at times at this stuff, and do you kind of wonder if somebody may be looking at you?
Well, I know that people looking at me. I mean, I guess my take has always been that okay, first off, the people who are doing these things like the swattings and these other things, look, they're cowards. They're bullies and they're cowards. Anybody who's doing that sort of thing has a bravery issue. I don't know how else to put it. A lot of the people who end up attacking us on this Kimberlin thing are these anonymous sock puppet accounts on Twitter or whatever, who will attack anything and everything. They attack if you have money, they'll attack you for that. Oh, you're rich. If you don't have money, oh, you're poor. So it's like they literally will attack you for anything that you've done or have ever done or have ever thought about doing, and they do it anonymously. So you can't say, well, let's look at you. Let's see if you're a perfect individual. That's why they do it. So they're cowards. So in that sense, I've never worried about it because cowards. What's a coward going to do? Call me? That's what they're afraid to do. And so I just have always felt like, and this way predates this story, but I've always felt like by being pretty transparent about that stuff, you actually lessen the amount. And I've written controversial political stuff for years, and I've really only had a couple weird things happen ever. And usually, when you talk to people one-on-one, they're different. If it's very easy for someone to hide behind a mask and be threatening, but then if they talk to you and it usually takes the level of confrontation down. So I don't know. Like I say, I've never. It's just the way I roll on that stuff. I might feel different if I was an attractive single woman or something like that. But well,
Lee Stranahan, we have just barely scratched the surface of what you're all about and what you've written, the Andrew Breitbart era of your life. So I encourage anybody listening to check that out at leestranahan.com. And this is John Grant from Los Angeles. Lee, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back with more on the 405 Live.